The most powerful man in the English Parliament does not sit on a throne. He does not sit on a carved oak chair decorated with royal insignia. He sits on a bag of wool. To this day, in the House of Lords in Westminster, the Lord Speaker of Great Britain presides from a cushion ceremonially stuffed with fibre. That tradition is over 600 years old, and it has never been changed. Because the people who created it understood perfectly where England's real power came from. Not from iron, not from gold, from sheep. And the remarkable thing is that they were absolutely right. To understand how a domesticated animal that spends its days eating grass became the foundation of the most powerful empire in human history, you have to go back to a time before empires existed at all. Approximately 10,000 years ago, in the rocky highland plateaus of what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria, human beings began doing something no species had ever attempted before. They started managing other animals, not hunting them. Managing them, controlling their breeding, their movements, their reproductive destinies. The animal they started with, in the case of sheep, was a wild creature called the mouflon. The mouflon looks nothing like the sheep you picture today. It is lean, fast, and muscular, with tight, reddish-brown fur and large curved horns. It has very little soft fiber. What it does have sheds naturally in spring, like a dog or a deer. Nobody was ever going to build an empire on mouflon fur. But over thousands of years of selective breeding, something extraordinary happened. When farmers consistently chose to keep and breed the animals with the softest, densest underfleeces rather than the toughest or fastest ones. Generation after generation, the fleece became thicker and finer. The natural shedding mechanism weakened. By around 6,000 years ago, farmers in the ancient Near East had developed sheep that grew wool continuously year-round and needed to be sheared by hand. They had not just domesticated an animal, they had redesigned one. The oldest known depiction of a woolly sheep appears on a limestone tablet found in Mesopotamia and dates to roughly 4000 BC. By 3000 BC, the ancient Sumerians had already built a city-scale wool industry. Cuneiform tablets from the ruins of Ur record detailed accounts of wool distribution, listing thousands of workers, millions of animals, and precise measurements of fiber weight and quality. This was not subsistence farming. This was organized industrial production across an entire civilization. Wool had one quality that made it unlike any other material available to ancient peoples, and that quality is why it spread so quickly across the world. It is warm. But what made wool extraordinary is that it is warm even when wet. It is the only natural fiber that retains most of its insulating capacity when soaked through. A wet linen garment in cold weather will kill you through hypothermia faster than wearing nothing at all. A wet wool garment will keep you alive. For soldiers, sailors, and anyone who spent their lives outdoors in a world without synthetics, this was not a comfort feature. It was survival. By the time the great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean were rising, wool was already the dominant textile of the human world. Egypt used it, Greece used it, Rome used it. The Latin word for wealth, pecunia, which is the root of the English word pecuniary, derives from pecus, meaning livestock, specifically sheep. When Romans talked about money, they were using a word that originally meant sheep. That is not a quirk of etymology. That is economic history compressed into a single syllable. But before any of that ancient commerce, thousands of years before Rome or Greece had built their first stone column, someone in the distant past had discovered something about wool that was worth more than anything an army could conquer. And the legend that grew up around that discovery was so powerful it survived 3,000 years. And most people who know it have no idea it was ever about wool at all. The myth of the Golden Fleece is one of the oldest stories in Western literature. The hero Jason sails to the distant land of Colchis at the far eastern edge of the Black Sea, searching for a fleece from a magical golden ram, a treasure guarded by a dragon that never sleeps. With the help of the sorceress Medea, he steals the fleece and returns home victorious. For most of modern history, scholars treated this as pure mythology. Then archaeologists paid closer attention to Colchis, which corresponds to the western coast of what is now Georgia. And they found something interesting. Ancient writers describing Colchis mentioned that the local people had a peculiar method of collecting gold dust from mountain rivers. They would stretch animal fleeces across the riverbed, allowing the fast-moving water to carry fine gold particles down from upstream mountain deposits. The wool fibers caught and trapped the gold dust. When saturated, the fleece was pulled out, dried, and beaten to release the collected gold. It was a primitive but surprisingly effective filter for placer gold. And the Caucasus region around Colchis was genuinely rich in exactly those deposits. Greek traders had real commercial contact with the eastern Black Sea coast centuries before the myth was written down in its classical form. The voyage of the Argonauts was almost certainly a mythologized memory of early Greek expeditions to a place where people really did use golden fleeces to collect real gold. But the deeper truth here is more interesting than the archaeology. The myth of the golden fleece is not a story about gold. It is a story about the extraordinary value the ancient world placed on wool. A fleece literally made of gold was the most powerful metaphor a Greek storyteller could reach for to convey how precious this material was. Wool was not compared to gold because people were confused. Wool was compared to gold because in the economies of the ancient world, wool traded like gold. And sometimes it was worth more. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the wool economy did not fall with it. The empire collapsed. The trade networks fragmented. The cities emptied. But the sheep survived. And in one cold, rainy, frequently invaded island at the edge of the known world, wool was about to begin its most consequential chapter. England in the early medieval period was not an obvious candidate to become the most powerful wool producer in the world. It was poor, wet, and perpetually at war. But it had grass. Extraordinary grass, as it turned out. The temperate maritime climate of England and Wales, with its regular rainfall and mild winters, produced a quality of pasture that no other region in northern Europe could quite replicate. Over many generations, English sheep developed fleeces of unusual length, weight, and fineness that had no equal in the continent. The monks noticed first. The Cistercian monasteries that spread across England following the Norman conquest of 1066 became the most sophisticated sheep farmers in the medieval world. Their abbeys managed flocks of tens of thousands of sheep across vast estates, selling annual wool clips through contracts negotiated years in advance. Flemish merchants had identified English wool as something genuinely special. The weavers of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres had built the most sophisticated cloth-making industry in Europe, but to produce that cloth, they needed raw material. The finest raw wool in northern Europe grew on English backs. This created an economic relationship of unusual intensity. England needed Flemish manufacturing. Flanders needed English fiber. Neither could prosper without the other, and the English crown, watching the money flow, began to understand its leverage. By the 13th century, wool exports made up somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total revenue of the English crown. Not 1/3 of trade income, 1/3 of all royal revenue. When Edward the Wine needed money to conquer Wales, he taxed wool. When Edward III needed to finance his wars in France, he taxed wool so aggressively it became the primary fiscal instrument of the English state for a generation. The symbol chosen to represent this was a large wool sack. Since the reign of Edward III, the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords has presided from a ceremonial seat stuffed with wool. It has never changed because it has always been accurate. Wool built England, and England built its parliament on top of it. The great wool churches of Suffolk, Norfolk, and the Cotswolds are monuments to the same understanding. Lavenham in Suffolk, a village of a few thousand people, built a 15th century church the size of a small cathedral. All of it paid for by wool merchants who left their fortunes to God. The stone carvings, the stained glass, the elaborate roofs, all bought with fiber. But for every merchant who built a church with his wool profits, there were thousands of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by wool in a very different way. Not enriched, destroyed. Because when a commodity becomes valuable enough, powerful people will do almost anything to control the land that produces it. In 1516, the philosopher Thomas More published Utopia. Embedded within it was a piece of social criticism sharp enough to last 5 centuries. More wrote that the sheep of England were devouring men. He did not mean it literally. He meant something almost more disturbing. The system that had sustained English rural society for generations was the open field system. Peasant farmers held strips across communal fields, grazed animals on shared common land, gathered firewood from shared woodland. It was not prosperous by modern standards, but it was complete. Millions of English families had lived within it for generations. The problem was what wool was worth. Raising sheep for fleece required large enclosed pastures, not thin strips of shared fields, and sheep required far less human labor than arable farming. A single shepherd with a dog could tend hundreds of animals, producing enormously valuable wool. You did not need dozens of farming families. You needed one man, one dog, and as much land as you could fence off. So the landlords began to enclose. They fenced off the common land. They evicted the tenant farmers who had cultivated those fields for generations, demolished their cottages, and converted everything to sheep pasture. The result was consistent wherever it happened. Communities that had existed for centuries were erased in years. Entire villages disappeared. People who had known no other life found themselves homeless, landless, and without any means of survival. Thomas More called it depopulation for the sake of greedy profit. Cardinal Wolsey launched formal inquiries. Parliament passed laws against it. Sermons condemned it. Rebellions broke out. In 1549, Robert Kett led thousands of farmers in an uprising in Norfolk against enclosure. The rebellion was crushed. Kett was executed. The enclosures continued. The economic logic was simply too powerful. An acre converted to sheep pasture generated more income for a landlord in a single year than the same acre farmed by tenants could produce in 5. By the time enclosure had largely run its course in the 18th century, millions of acres had been converted to pasture and hundreds of thousands of people had been displaced. Those displaced people crowded into towns. Into London, into the expanding industrial centers of the north. The landless poor who filled those cities became the labor pool for the factories that were beginning to appear. The enclosure movement, driven by the economics of wool, directly created the urban working class that made the Industrial Revolution possible. The sheep ate the men. The men built the mills. The mills made England rich. It is one of the most brutal causal chains in modern history, and wool is at the start of it. While this was happening on English farms, the other great wool power in the world was running a very different strategy. Spain had something England had never had and could not buy at any price. An animal whose fleece was unlike anything else in nature. And they protected it with a ferocity that makes modern patent law look relaxed. The Merino sheep is one of the most consequential animals in economic history. It is not large, not robust, and not easy to keep, but its fleece is extraordinary. The individual fibers of a high-quality merino are so fine, in some varieties thinner than the finest human hair, that properly processed merino wool is virtually indistinguishable from silk by touch alone. There is no other natural fiber in the world with those characteristics. By the 13th century, the Spanish crown understood that the merino was a strategic asset of the first order. The Mesta, a guild of sheep owners so powerful it ranked among the most influential institutions in medieval Spain. managed millions of animals across seasonal migration routes called cañadas, driving enormous flocks between summer mountain pastures and winter lowland grazing grounds. At its height, the Mesta controlled approximately 3 million sheep. For 2 centuries, exporting live Merino sheep from Spain was a capital offense. The penalty for attempting to remove a breeding animal from Spanish territory was death. Not a fine. Death. The Spanish crown had classified the Merino as a state secret and enforced that classification with the same instruments it used to enforce all state power in the early modern period. This was a trade monopoly backed by the threat of execution, and it held for a remarkably long time. What broke the monopoly was not English ingenuity. It was a diplomatic gift. In 1765, the Spanish crown gave a flock of pure Merino breeding stock to the King of Saxony as a gesture to an ally. Around 100 animals were sent. Saxony received them with enthusiasm. Within a decade, the Saxon Merinos were breeding successfully. France established its own Merino flock at the royal estate of Rambouillet. The Dutch followed. Sweden followed. The monopoly that had held for 2 centuries unraveled in less than a generation. In 1797, Britain sent 30 Merino sheep to a colony established 9 years earlier as a penal settlement on the other side of the planet. It did not look like the opening move of an agricultural revolution, but it was. Before we get to Australia, we need to understand what was happening inside Britain during the 18th century. Because the Industrial Revolution, the transformation that did more to reshape human civilization than any event since the invention of agriculture, began in wool. Not in coal, not in steam, not in iron, in fiber. The traditional process of turning raw fleece into finished cloth in 1700 looked almost identical to the process used in 1300. Wool had to be cleaned, sorted, carded to align the fibers, spun into yarn, woven on large looms, fulled and finished. Each step required skilled workers, and every step moved only as fast as human hands allowed. The fatal bottleneck was spinning. A skilled weaver could consume yarn faster than 4 or 5 spinners could produce it. Weavers sat idle, waiting for thread. The entire output of the textile industry was fundamentally constrained by how fast human fingers could twist fiber. James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny around 1764, allowing one operator to spin 8 threads simultaneously. Richard Arkwright's water frame of 1769 used water power to drive spinning faster than any human hand. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule of 1779 combined both technologies to produce fine, consistent yarn of extraordinary quality. Within a generation, a single mechanized spinning facility exceeded the combined output of hundreds of hand spinners. Edmund Cartwright mechanized weaving with his power loom in 1785, and the transformation accelerated. The wool mills that appeared along the rivers of Yorkshire were not just new factories. They were the first examples of the factory system in human history. The idea of organizing workers in a single location, performing specialized tasks on machinery owned by an employer in exchange for wages, an arrangement so familiar now that it seems natural, was invented in the textile mills of England. Working with wool, Yorkshire became the center of the wool manufacturing world. Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Huddersfield, machine-made English woolen cloth flooded markets across Europe, Asia, and eventually the entire world. British wool cloth was consistent in quality and cheap enough to undercut handmade production almost everywhere it reached. But there was a problem. To feed these mills, Britain needed enormous quantities of raw fiber. English farms could not produce enough. The mills demanded more raw material than the British Isles could grow. And someone, looking at a map of the world, noticed a continent that was mostly empty, had a climate suited to pastoral farming, and already belonged to the British Crown. The colony of New South Wales had been established in 1788 with 11 ships carrying convicts and their guards. Nobody was thinking about wool. They were thinking about whether the surrounding environment was going to kill them before the next supply ship arrived. What followed was one of the most consequential agricultural decisions in the history of empires. John MacArthur arrived in New South Wales in 1790 as a military officer. He was argumentative, insubordinate, and remarkable at making enemies. He was court-martialed twice. He killed a man in a duel. He was so disruptive that he became the central figure in the Rum Rebellion of 1808, in which colonial troops arrested the sitting governor of New South Wales, the same Governor Bligh who had previously survived the mutiny on the Bounty. He was also the person who understood, before almost anyone else, what the land around Sydney could do with the right animals on it. When those 30 Merino sheep arrived in the colony in 1797, MacArthur acquired breeding stock, established a systematic crossing program, and developed a fleece that combined Merino fineness with a robustness suited to Australian conditions. He sent samples to textile merchants in England. Their response was unanimous. This was some of the finest wool they had ever tested. The potential was obvious to anyone in the trade. The scale of what followed is difficult to convey concisely. In 1810, the total sheep population of New South Wales was around 100,000 animals. By 1840, nearly 7 million. By 1890, Australia held approximately 100 million sheep, supplying a very substantial proportion of the raw fiber consumed by the entire British textile industry. The economic logic was stark. Australian land was, from the perspective of British colonists, essentially free, taken from Aboriginal peoples who received no compensation and were killed in large numbers when they resisted. Early colonial labor was provided by convicts who received no wages. The climate allowed year-round grazing without the enormous winter fodder costs that English farmers faced every year. The men who seized those land opportunities were called squatters. They pushed their flocks hundreds of miles into the interior, staking informal claims to millions of acres. By the 1840s, the squatters effectively controlled the economic life of the Australian interior, and the colonial government repeatedly had to legitimize their land occupation because the wool they were producing had become indispensable to the British economy back home. The phrase Australians used throughout the 19th century was that the country was riding on the sheep's back. Wool accounted for the majority of Australian export income for most of the century. Wool revenues built the roads, the railways, the banks, and the commercial institutions of Sydney and Melbourne. New Zealand developed a parallel economy across the same decades. Vast sheep stations covering the Canterbury Plains and Otago High Country, producing merino wool of exceptional quality that flowed to British mills. This was the British imperial system working exactly as designed. Raw materials produced cheaply in colonies, transported to Britain for processing, transformed into finished goods in British factories, sold to the world at substantial profit. Wool was the commodity around which this entire logic was most successfully and durably organized. But the 20th century was not kind to wool, not because the fiber became less useful, not because the sheep disappeared, but because the world that had made wool so absolutely indispensable was changing in ways no amount of merino breeding or parliamentary legislation could stop. And the industry that had built empires and funded wars was about to discover what happens when history moves past you. The problems came from several directions simultaneously, and they compounded each other. The first pressure was cotton. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1793, mechanized the separation of cotton fibers from their seeds and made large-scale cotton production viable for the first time. American cotton, grown on slave plantations in the South, flooded into textile markets at prices wool could not match for everyday clothing. Wool retained its position in quality and cold weather markets, but cotton took over the mass market for shirts, undergarments, and light clothing. The second and more decisive pressure was synthetic fiber. Nylon was introduced commercially in 1938. Polyester followed in the 1940s. Acrylic arrived in the early 1950s. These petroleum-derived fibers could be manufactured at costs far below any natural material and could be engineered to mimic specific properties with precision. For everyday clothing, synthetics were simply better value than wool for most purposes. They were washable without shrinking, resistant to moths, and required none of the careful handling that wool demanded. The collapse in demand hit Australia with particular severity. Through the 1960s and 1970s, prices were supported by a government scheme that set a floor price and stockpiled excess production. In 1991, the scheme collapsed under the weight of its own accumulated stockpile. Nearly 4.7 million bales of unsold wool, enough to supply the entire world industry for almost a year. The forced sale over the following years depressed prices further and pushed enormous numbers of wool growers into bankruptcy. The national flock, which had peaked at approximately 180 million sheep in the early 1970s, declined to roughly 70 million by the 2020s. Britain's own wool industry contracted sharply from the mid-20th century. Yorkshire mills could not compete with cheaper Asian production. Bradford, which had called itself the wool capital of the world through the Victorian era, lost most of its textile manufacturing between the 1950s and the 1980s. The mills fell silent, converted to apartments, or were demolished. And yet wool did not disappear. It did something characteristic of genuinely useful things. It retreated from markets it had lost and rediscovered the ones where nothing else could replace it. At the performance end of the clothing market, Merino wool found an extraordinary second life. The properties that made wool valuable to ancient nomads, its moisture management, its temperature regulation, its natural resistance to bacterial odor, turned out to be exactly what the modern outdoor clothing and travel apparel markets were looking for. A base layer made from superfine merino can be worn for multiple days without washing, regulates body temperature from cold mornings to warm afternoons, and does not accumulate the bacterial odor that synthetic equivalents develop after a single hard day. Brands building performance garments discovered that fine merino outperformed synthetics in the conditions where performance actually mattered. The sustainability argument has become increasingly significant as the environmental costs of synthetic textiles are better understood. Synthetic fibers shed microscopic plastic particles into water systems every time they are washed. These microplastics are now found in drinking water, ocean sediments, and the tissues of marine animals worldwide. Wool is grown by animals on grass, powered by photosynthesis, producing a fiber that is naturally renewable, completely biodegradable, and has been part of human material culture for 10,000 years. At the luxury end, the finest merino suiting fabrics woven in English and Italian mills still sell at prices that reflect genuine rarity and quality. The bespoke tailoring houses of Savile Row still specify the finest wool as their primary material. The Harris tweed industry of the Outer Hebrides, which by law must be hand-woven in the weaver's own homes using locally grown and spun wool, produces cloth at premium prices worldwide. It has survived because it makes something a machine cannot replicate. Cloth that carries in it the evidence of the hands and the landscape that produced it. Take a moment to trace the full length of this thread. 10,000 years ago, a shepherd decided not to kill a sheep, but to keep it alive for its fiber. That decision, multiplied across millennia, produced an animal of extraordinary utility. 3,000 years ago, Greek traders brought back stories of fleeces so valuable they were worth sailing to the edge of the world to find. The myth that grew from those stories gave Western civilization one of its defining images of heroic quest. 1,000 years ago, English monks discovered that their island's grass produced the finest long staple fleece in Northern Europe and built a commercial system around it that funded an emerging national state. 700 years ago, the Hundred Years' War between England and France was fought partly over who would control the wool trade and the Flemish weavers who depended on it. English kings taxed their sheep to pay for their armies. The parliamentary oversight of royal taxation that grew from those negotiations became the foundation of British constitutional government. 500 years ago, landlords fenced off English fields to run sheep on them and drove hundreds of thousands of people into cities, creating the urban working class that would populate the factories of the Industrial Revolution. 300 years ago, the first mechanized spinning machines were built to speed up the processing of wool fiber, and in doing so invented the factory as an economic institution, the model from which all subsequent industrial capitalism derived. 200 years ago, 30 Merino sheep were sent to a penal colony in the Pacific. Within a century, that colony had 100 million animals feeding raw fiber to the mills of Yorkshire, and a continent had been organized around the commercial logic they represented. The woolsack in the House of Lords is not a quaint historical relic. It is a compressed statement of economic fact. The seat of British political power has been stuffed with fiber since the 14th century because wool paid for that power, built the institutions that exercise it, organized the empire that extended it, and funded the military that defended it. The Golden Fleece was never a myth. It was always a description, and the dragon guarding it was not a monster. It was history, all 10,000 years of it. If you made it this far, you just learned the economic foundation of the British Empire through the story of a single material, and you now know something most people walking past Parliament every day have no idea about. The most important seat in British politics is literally stuffed with wool. That is the kind of thing that changes how you see the world. Hit subscribe so you catch the next video when it drops. Drop a comment telling us which part surprised you most. Was it the Golden Fleece having a real origin? Was it that Thomas More wrote that sheep were literally devouring human beings? Or was it that 30 animals from a Spanish diplomatic gift eventually produced 100 million sheep and built an entire continent's economy? Let us know below.